Hey y'all, it's Mr. Gallion. We're going to talk today a little bit about standard 8 point, man, I was just looking at it and I forgot the number. 8.4b, there we go. Um, in the first section of standard 8.4, we looked at the differences, kind of overarching differences between liberals and conservatives. And we're going to take a look now at what happened in the late part of the 20th century to kind of bring back the conservatives. If you think about it for just a minute, hang on. If you think about it for just a minute, there's kind of an interesting thing that happens in the mid part of the 20th century. You've got Harry Truman, who's actually preceded by Franklin Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and those guys all have one thing in common, and that's that they're all Democrats. They're all on the liberal side of the spectrum. In that exact same time, you've only got one Republican president, and that is Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he's a war hero. So of course he's going to get elected. People remember him. They think about him fondly. They're like, oh, cool, this is great. So there's going to be this thing that happens in the latter part of the 1900s where people are kind of thinking maybe we've gone a little bit too far, right? Maybe we ought to go back to the way things used to be before. We've changed society a lot. Let's try to roll that back a little bit. I mean, think about the way that government's grown in the 1900s so far, okay? The New Deal gets government much, much more involved in society and in economics than it ever was before. You've got Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society, where he's trying to solve issues like education for people in poverty and poverty as a whole, and medical issues. The civil rights movement is a new way that the government has gotten involved in things that it wasn't before. It used to be that the states and individuals could decide, and now the government is inserting itself into the choices that people are making about how they treat people of different races. And then when the women's rights movement is growing, and there's a segment of society that's a little bit concerned about this, okay? There's this real question about what is the proper role of government? Is it to guarantee civil rights to all people, okay? Or is it to protect my freedom? And those things might seem like they go together, but if you tell me that I have to treat people of other races and other genders away differently than what I want, it can be argued, even though I think it's not wise to, it can be argued that, well, that limits my freedom. If I want to be racist, I can be racist. Again, this is not my view. It's how a lot of people viewed it at the time. And so there are, and let me be very careful before I jump in here. I'm not trying to say that all conservatives wanted to do, and the reason this shows up is that conservatives wanted to be sexist and racist. Okay, that's not the case. However, there is a concern that government is suddenly inserting itself into places it shouldn't, and what's going to come next. So some people, don't like the sexist, racist, limitations now. But some people are afraid of, well, if they do that, what about my religious freedom? What about this? What about the other thing? And so there's this growing concern about that. And this movement becomes known as the New Right. These are conservatives who start to say, the government's getting way too big. That's not a healthy thing. And you start seeing entertainers who start really leaning into this. Like up in the top left, you've got a guy named Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh is huge when it comes to the conservative resurgence in the late 1980s, the early 1990s. When I was a kid, I used to watch Rush Limbaugh's TV show every day, and I'd listen to his radio show sometimes. It was on when I was at school. He's still on today. Okay, so this is from the mid-90s until today. He actually just got, President Trump just gave him a Medal of Honor, Presidential Medal of Freedom. I had to look it up. So he's still very much involved in pushing these conservative ideas in society here. Yep, sorry, I'm having computer issues. Okay, you're also going to have these televangelists who are going to show up. And televangelists are not as widely viewed as they were in the 80s. But you've got this growth of a conservative evangelical movement, like this is Pat Robertson, who actually still has a TV show, the 700 Club you might have heard of. And these guys very much tie their faith in with politics. There's a strong connection between conservatism, at least social conservatism, ideas like we don't want legalization of drugs, and homosexuality, gay marriage shouldn't be legal, and abortion is bad. And these ideas get very closely intertwined with Christianity. And so people who tend to be conservative, tend to be evangelical, watch this stuff and they're like, yeah, this kind of the volume with which this message is proclaimed and the frequency with which it's proclaimed makes a lot of people say, yeah, that's where I am. That's what I like. The first president that you're going to see who is really kind of an exemplar of the new right is Richard Nixon. Okay. Richard Nixon gets elected after Lyndon Johnson decides he's not going to run for office again. He's elected in 1968. And if you know anything about Nixon, what you know about him is that the Watergate scandal happens, and we'll talk about that just a little bit down the road, so hold tight. But it makes a lot of people wonder, is the president doing things that are illegal and sketchy? And did we make a mistake with electing somebody who's conservative? And so after him, the conservatives take a little bit of a backseat in society, and Jimmy Carter, who's a Democrat, is elected in 1976. But even as Democrats go, he's kind of relatively conservative. Okay. Now, the problem is that Carter gets elected and he has all these economic issues, which we're going to talk about. Hold on. There's a crisis in the Middle East. We've already talked about the issues with Iran and the hostage crisis, and he can't bring that to an end. Double-digit inflation. What that means is that you start seeing prices go up by at least 10% a year under him. There's an energy crisis. There's not enough gas, partly because of the issues in the Middle East. And Jimmy Carter's presidency just doesn't go super well. And so the middle class is hurt. When he can't end the Iran hostage crisis, people are really concerned that maybe the United States isn't the world leader it used to be before. And so people say, yeah, let's see if maybe we can find somebody who's conservative, who's on the right side of things politically, because, just Jimmy Carter thing just didn't work out. Well, onto the scene comes exactly the person that the country's looking for. It's a conservative who's just got a way with words. He's got a great image, partly because he used to be a movie star, and that is Ronald Reagan. Okay. Reagan had been a movie star in the 1950s. He'd been California's governor in the 1960s and into the 70s. He actually was a Democrat back then, so he's got a little bit of kind of centrist pull, at least at the beginning. And he's this super patriotic guy. He loves America. He's very positive. He's funny. He's got all these funny little quips that he offers. He is at the time the oldest president elected, and he's very famously asked in one of his debates, do you think that age ought to be an issue in this campaign? And he says, no, I don't want to exploit my opponent's youth and inexperience, which is great if you're the old guy who's got some experience, right? And that diffuses it, and it's really not brought up much moving into the future. Now, Reagan, just to give you an idea, some of the things that he says, this gives you an idea of the kind of things that he says that really gets people sort of riled up, okay, and excited. He says, of the 4 wars in my lifetime, none came about because the United States was too strong. In other words, we need a strong country and a strong military. We're never defeated unless we give up on God. So he's pointing back to religious heritage. And again, remember these televangelists, these conservative evangelicals? They're like, yeah, we want this guy. He's talking about religion openly and loudly. He says government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives. And again, if your concern is the growth of government, man, you're going to vote for Reagan. And he goes even further. Maybe one of his most famous quotes is, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. So let's put our weight on the people, not on the government. The day that he's inaugurated, the Iranian hostages that Carter couldn't get back are returned. Now, Reagan hasn't done anything to bring him back, but this kind of adds to the overall optimism. That era is over. We have a whole new era ahead of us. Now, in Reagan's presidency, he's going to bring back some of these conservative ideals. He says, let's be very economically conservative. The government shouldn't be spending all this money, okay? We're going to limit how much the government spends. If you can't spend more than what you earn, the government shouldn't do that either, which makes a certain amount of sense, okay? So he also says, let's make sure that you have more money in your pocket, so let's cut taxes on the wealthy. And you say, wait a minute, what about the average people? He says, if we cut taxes on the wealthy and businesses, they will reinvest that money. They'll hire people who don't have jobs. And so now people who were struggling to find work will get work, and the economy will grow as a result. We call this trickle-down economics. If you give money to the rich, the idea is that'll make things better for everybody underneath them. Okay, and that is debated. There are some people who would still very firmly argue that, and other people say, no, you want to cut taxes on the middle class, because if they spend more money, then people are going to have to, or businesses are going to have to grow and hire more people. Okay. He cuts government spending, which, believe it or not, is actually kind of a controversial thing. And there are reasons for that. I'm happy to get into that for you. If you want to know, you can ask me in one of those Ask Mr. Gallion things if you know what I'm talking about. Let's see, conservatives tend to love Reagan. In fact, I love this picture because it's totally insane, but it's kind of this. Reagan is a hero, right? He's a superhero riding a Tyrannosaurus. You like that, Grace? Yeah, she likes it. Shooting a machine gun. He's got a rocket launcher strapped to his back. It's great. He's finally changed this trend of government's growth that started all the way back in the night. He looks like, oh yeah, from Just Cause. Yeah. That started all the way back in the 1930s. Now, Reagan, though, even though he cuts some government programs, he also spends huge amounts of money. Remember, we're in the middle of the Cold War with Russia. He believes that the United States needs to be super strong. And so one of the concerns as the nuclear race or the arms race has grown is that we might get nuked. So he dumps all this money into a program called Star Wars. The idea is if Russia ever launched a nuke, we would have satellites in space that could see it, intercept it, and blow it up. Okay, it's called Star Wars. It's actually a strategic defense initiative, but Star Wars was super popular in the 80s, so that's the popular name it goes by. Reagan's going to limit all kinds of regulations because, remember, we want to pull back on how much government is involved in people's lives. So he pulls back regulations on businesses and banks and the environment. People felt like these regulations slowed down free enterprise. Okay. If I have to worry about all these regulations, I can't grow my business. I got to make sure I'm doing what the government wants me to, is the idea. Okay. Now, I like this cartoon because this is an opposing idea. This guy's cutting down all these signs, which are a form of government regulations. And I would argue that this guy's saying regulation is a good thing sometimes because it can protect people. But imagine if you had a stop sign every 10 feet. You can also over-regulate. And so there's this balancing act, and conservatives and liberals go back and forth on this in different presidencies. Now, Reaganomics is still very much debated, thank you, debated today. Defense spending under Reagan actually leads to budget deficits. Under Reagan, we triple the national debt. Now, we've gone way beyond that since, but the budget's multiplied. So yes, he cuts spending, but he also triples the debt. Now, there'd been a recession in the 70s. The economy is going to start growing in the 1980s. So why all these pictures? Why Mario? Because the reason all these toys are so popular, G.I. Joe, the Transformers, Star Wars, and Nintendo, is because all of a sudden the economy is great and kids are telling their parents, I want toys, and their parents have money to go buy it, okay? This deregulation, though, please don't. This deregulation is going to cause some problems, okay? Even in 2008, when the banks crash, some people trace it back to the fact that there was too little regulation. Banks need to have some limits as to what they can and can't do. In both situations, in the 80s and 2008, banks have to be bailed out or given a whole bunch of money to make sure they stay afloat. Okay? That pie chart shows that the 2008 bailout cost as much as all these things together. And oh yeah, we just had a bailout in 2020. Not a bailout exactly, but a spending plan that was even more than that. So now there are all kinds of new jobs that are created, but critics say, yeah, but it's in low-paying service industries. It's carpenters, it's plumbers, it's that kind of thing. And I would say, sure, but those are jobs, and jobs are good. So I'm not going to complain too loudly. During Reagan's presidency, nobody really addresses the fact that lots of jobs are being missed or lost to overseas, and that's a trend that's continued into today. Now, because of this trend, Reagan has sort of set the tone even for politics in 2020, because people tend to say conservatives believe in traditional values, at least they typically say that. That's changing a little bit. And economic growth. If you want economic growth, vote for conservatives. And because of Reagan's successful painting of liberals, people say, look how much money they waste on all these different programs. Reagan was able to cut them, why can't you? And government being overgrown. Liberals try to say, no, we're sticking up for the middle class. And we want the government to be strong so we can stick up for the middle class, so we can help unions and people on welfare and that kind of a thing. And that debate continues today. All right, y'all, I'd talk a little bit more about this, but my video gets cut off in 15 minutes and I'm almost there. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have questions. Bye.